Hello, my name is Tim Wilmot, and in this video I'm going to paint quite a simple scene in watercolor and use a few techniques that if you're a beginner you may not be too familiar with. If this is the first time you've seen one of my videos, or if you're a beginner with watercolor, then I hope this tutorial will be useful to you as a structure and a process for creating a painting using the watercolor medium. There are thousands of videos out there on the YouTube platform on watercolor, going through all the basic techniques of drawing, laying down a wash, blending colors, and some of the watercolor techniques like wet in wet, for example. But in this video I'm going to go through start to finish the complete process, a complete painting, with a little bit of commentary along the way. So as a beginner, it's very useful to follow those exercises that you can find out there on YouTube. Get the basic skills to know how to use watercolor, and then as you get more experience, just try and use different techniques, bend the rules a little bit, and that's really what this video is about, trying to do things that are a little bit different. So here is the scene I'm going to paint. This is Newquay, down in Cornwall in the UK. It's quite a busy tourist town. It has this port harbour down the lower part of the town. So here above the harbour we've got some buildings, and then the harbour is over to the right hand side here. And why this scene? Well, it's got plenty of values. Values work well in watercolor. That is the difference between light and dark. So we've got some really dark background. We've got the dark background of this building on the left hand side. This is the lifeboat house or museum down in the harbour area, but lovely dark there and dark of the background. But then the light of the sunlight hitting these rooftops, these poles, the car, some of the buildings in the background as well. So that's going to work well, those differences in light and shade, light and dark in watercolor. We've got some nice shapes as well. Just think of, when you look at a composition, think of shapes, triangles, squares, circles, and so on. Nice shapes here with these rooftops, the road curving around going up to the town from the harbour. So it's sort of leading you into the scene. We've got a little bit of a story going on here, a little bit of a journey going through the painting with that road going away from us and go around to the left hand side. Also, these yellow grid lines, they're quite useful from a composition point of view to lead our eyes into the scene. So there's a little bit of perspective to consider in this painting. We've got this car. If you look at this scene straight away afresh, maybe your eyes go straight to that car. Now, from a composition point of view, it may not be a good idea to have this right in the middle as it is now. So I will be moving that off to the side so it's not a dominant thing there in the middle. I will also include a figure, which I will most likely put on the left hand side here. So there's a little bit of light against the dark, again using those values, light against dark, dark against light. We've got, I mentioned the buildings in the background at the top of these cliffs. They're quite tricky. Look at all the different shapes we've got with these gable windows and light hitting the window frames and chimneys as well. So quite a tricky thing there to contend with. Okay, so let's make a start. So first step, of course, is doing the outline drawing, and the paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford cold press, 300 grams. The size to fit it's an ideal size really for my filming here for these YouTube videos is 11 inches by 15 inches. So getting the initial drawing right is of paramount importance. If I get the drawing wrong, then everything goes downhill. It's very difficult to rectify a painting if you haven't planned it or done the drawing correctly. So first of all, those two building ends, the Lifeboat Station, and there's a little shop or souvenir shop to the right of it, and of course going down from left to right, just the outline of those buildings in the background. So that is background, so I don't want to put too much detail into those. I've just really drawn the outline shapes of the building tops. Down to the middle ground, going back to what I said earlier about shapes, just thinking about shapes here of the triangles and the angles of the rooftops, the shapes of the shadows. I'm using a soft pencil, so it gives a fairly dark line, which will make it easier to follow with watercolor. And don't worry about pencil lines showing through in the end painting. I think that adds a bit of a charm to watercolor. So don't worry about those lines showing through. Now that white car right in the middle, so I've just moved it a little bit to the right. And then the road curving around to the left up the hill. There's that little hut, little kiosk on the right hand side, that brown kiosk. I don't want to make that too brown. When I come on to painting this, I don't want to make that too brown or red. It would draw your attention too much to that. So figure on the left hand side, starting with the head, shoulders, and sometimes when I start drawing a figure, I haven't actually decided exactly in which direction this figure is going to walk, but having it there on the left hand side, I think it would be a good idea to have this figure moving into the picture, walking from left to right rather than right to left, and include the whole figure rather than just the top of the figure popping up from the foreground. Include the whole figure. It works best. Quite a few objects on the right hand side. In the distance on the beach there's some boats there, some small boats. I'll ignore those. There's too much detail on the right hand side. We want to place more emphasis in the middle portion of the picture rather than on the extremities, on the perimeter of the picture. So building on the left hand side, the Lifeboat Station, just a few details of the building there. Above the main door there's this lovely window coming out, nice and blue, so I'll put a little bit of emphasis on that against a little bit of light blue against the dark background. That should work quite well, and it's another interesting shape in there as well. So once I'm happy with the drawing, the outline drawing, next step is to lay down the first wash. Now the palette on the right hand side, quite simple, going from the top, neutral tint, coming down I've got burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, scarlet red, a light red, cadmium orange, and cadmium yellow. So with the sky, the light is coming from the left hand side, so it needs to be lighter on the left and then darker on the right hand side. So I started from the left hand side. Generally that's the way I'll work, is from left to right, being right handed. So with a big brush, as big a brush as I've got, and I'm using a Raphael mop brush here, soft aqua mop brush, as big a brush as you can get for the size of paper you're using. We're covering nearly the whole of the scene here, except those areas that I want to leave brightest, like the car, for example, like maybe some of the smaller rooftops. So I'm covering the background buildings with that sky, and then coming down, as I say, I'm just covering the paper with some, basically anything that's in the palette here. I'm using now a combination of burnt umber and ultramarine blue. Those areas that I want to keep lighter, I'll be doing a bit of careful painting around, like the figure there, and the car in the middle, and that rooftop. It's good to have a mop brush that's got a good edge to it, so I can be a bit more precise when painting around objects. So back to that background, paint over it, cover up the background. And a lot of this, a lot of the painting now will just be the end color. So for example, the sky won't be touched again, the road won't be touched again. I won't go over that except for the markings. So this is quite an important stage. A little bit of reddish brown. This will dry a lot lighter as well. So a bit of reddish brown for that kiosk, and then a bit of yellow ochre just to indicate the beach on the right hand side. Now of course the paper is still very wet, still very damp. I've gone in now with the blue of the upper window of the lifeboat station, and a bit of blue there for the door. So after that initial wash stage, you've got to let the paper dry 100%, and then we can start going in with darker colours. One thing I should have mentioned about the sky is that some people would do a wash by painting from left to right, right to left, horizontal lines, and just carefully come down the paper and holding the paper at a slight angle. I do have a slight angle on this paper, but I've gone for more of a loose approach, the bigger brush, and you saw me there just sort of slapping it on at different angles, and I think that gives sometimes quite a nice effect to the sky. It doesn't make it so flat in appearance, a bit of texture to it. So as I say, next stage, after the paper has dried completely, we're going to go in with the darks, and I'll start from the left hand side, top left corner, and background first. Get these tricky buildings in. So I'm going down a size in brush now, more of a medium sized mop brush. the background is quite dark, and I need to keep it dark to give a bit of contrast with the light hitting the rooftops in the middle ground, these two main buildings. So a bit of a classic mixture of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, bit of alizarin crimson, and then starting from this left hand side again, like I did the sky, just brushstrokes in a number of different directions to give a bit of texture to that background. And this is what watercolor does as well. When you paint in that way, you end up with little light areas, little darker areas, and I think that's quite nice in watercolor. So a bit of careful painting around the rooftop. Continue on to the right hand side of the lifeboat station. And honestly, these buildings, we just got to do them quite quickly, but just leave little gaps here and there, maybe where the sunlight is catching the side of a window or an extension to a building. I'll add a few darks to those background buildings later on when this is dried. For example, just to define the rooftops a bit more, or some chimneys or aerials or whatever. Street lights up there on the hill. So you can see I've got quite a lot of paint on this brush, so I don't need to keep refilling it. That's quite a common mistake, if you like. I see beginners with watercolor, they have too small a brush and not enough paint on that brush as well. So you end up with seeing the brush marks on the paper, which sometimes, if they're not confident brush marks, it doesn't often work, and you run out of paint, so you then got to go back and mix some additional paint, and then you go back on top of it, and you just see these different layers, and you can see these edges appearing. You lose that sort of fresh appeal of watercolor. You just got to kind of learn how watercolor reacts and go with it. So it's just this darker color now is just starting to bleed with those houses above there. Do you see? It doesn't really matter. They just let it, if that's what happened, just let it do that. We don't want a continuous line across the top there. We want to break up the line a little bit. I put a little slither, a little triangle slither there, just to maybe give the impression of the top of the cliff just catching the sunlight. It's predominantly green, the cliff side here, with brambles or weeds or shrubs growing down it, so I've kept it fairly green, and I will need to add in some darks here and there. So I just dabbed the brush. Everything is still quite moist, still quite damp. I've just gone back to those areas and just dabbed in with the brush, and that can just lift off a little bit of color, just to introduce a few lighter patches. Don't overdo it. If you're trying this yourself, don't overdo it, otherwise you can end up with it being a little bit overworked and you lose that freshness. So coming down now to the middle ground in these buildings, So following the rooftop and this lovely blue window extension coming out, make a little bit of a feature of that. Again, like the background, we've got a kind of patchy variation of lights and darks appearing in this wall. We don't want to have it all one value. So bits of it are dark, bits of it are a little bit lighter. This particular mop brush it's actually quite an old brush, and it's lost the point. It lost the point some time ago, and it's starting to fall apart. Hence the hence the tape around it. But I still quite like it as a brush because, having lost the point, it's still got quite a good edge, and it gives you these sort of unusual marks, brush marks. So it's not too precise like a new brush would be. And I quite like it. As long as you get used to, with anything, if you get used to the tools you use, then you just know how they're going to react in certain situations and different effects. And that's the key thing in watercolor, is getting used to the tools you're using, and maybe don't keep changing your equipment. Don't keep buying new brushes and trying new brushes. Just get some decent ones to start with and stick with them, and just really try to understand how they work in different situations. Now, there are lots of vertical white lampposts in this scene and lines. I'm not. You could, with watercolor, you could carefully paint around those, but it would be too fiddly, and the danger is we might lose the freshness of it. So one of the debatable techniques I'm going to be using is with a dry brush and with paint straight out of the tube. I'm going to paint in with white paint some of these white lines. That'll be one of the later stages of the drawing. So that's one of the later stages of the painting. So that's why you'll see me here not painting around these posts. As I'm coming down to street level, I'm going a little bit darker and a little bit thicker with the paint consistency. Everything is still wet, so it's blending in quite nicely with the building. I don't have the appearance of sort of the building, the side of the building, and then there's a line, and we have the dark shadows there, almost all as one, because I'm doing this as the paint is still moist and damp. That sort of technique can be quite difficult if you're painting plein air on a nice sunny day when things are drying too quickly, and it's very difficult to control things. A lot easier when you're working indoors like I am now, working from a photograph, and you've got a certain level of humidity in the room, and anything above 40-50% humidity is going to work well with watercolor. When you're outside on a sunny day and it can be 20-30% humidity, or maybe even less, that can get quite tricky, and you've got to work really fast, particularly if you've got a large paper, large painting to do. So with this car, these shadows, can you see there is a slight slope on the painting, but the paint, this darker colour now from the shadows, is going up. It's going into that moist area. The wash of the car, the shadow of the side of the car was light. It was fairly moist, but then I went in with the darker, thicker shadows, and it went up into, and we got a nice blending of colours there. So to the right hand side, not too much detail. There is a lot going on with bollards and the wall and little boats lying on the beach. So not too much over there, but I'm just indicating different shapes, just thinking about these different objects. Doesn't really matter what they are. Could be anything. There is that kiosk there, but I haven't put too much emphasis on it. I think if I made it too bright, too red, put too much effort into it, it might detract from viewing the figure walking up the road or that car. Now, figures can be quite tricky when we have the direction of the sunlight as it is now, almost behind us, over to the left. Quite tricky to know or decide how to do these shadows, and particularly with the legs. I tend to not overemphasize the legs. If you do that, if you put too much effort into painting legs of figures, you might lose the sense of movement, and the legs could be too thick or too thin, and sometimes it can be quite tricky. So I tend to, most of the time, not put a lot of effort into the legs, but get right the proportion of the head and the body, and the size of the figure in relation to other objects around, like the building or the car. So the figure doesn't appear too large, doesn't appear too small in context of the other things around it. Now the background is still these cliffs. They're still fairly damp, still fairly moist. So I'm going in now with a smaller brush, a smaller detail brush, and here's another technique for you. Just smudging with the fingers, like any technique. Don't overdo like any technique like this. Don't overdo it, but just to blend in the colours while things are still fairly moist and damp, just to get a softer edge to that darker figure, the darker shapes. Now, the buildings in the background, they're fairly dry now, so just a little bit of darker paint just here and there to give an indication of buildings, rooftops, sometimes you need to work fairly quickly when you're working on top of a damp wash. So this is starting to dry up now, so I'm going to have to work quite quickly getting in the darker lines around the sides of the roof. then just apply a few lines to the curve of that road and a few details to the car. Back with my medium-sized mop brush now, and the dark blue door of the lifeboat station. Which allows me to paint around this figure. I've got to be fairly careful here, particularly on the left-hand side where the light's coming from. Not so important on the right-hand side. Another common mistake I see beginners doing watercolor is with figures in leaving a sort of light halo around the outside of the figure, which it just doesn't look right, and you may get where the light's coming from, you may get a lighter outline to a figure there, but certainly not on the opposite side to where the light's coming from. So just be wary of that. Beginners out there in painting, putting figures into your landscape, your street scene, don't have a white edge all around the figure. It can sometimes help painting over parts of the figure. Again, a bit of smudging. Bit more dark under that porch cover, which coming down to the car, giving a bit more contrast again. Windscreen of the car. And a bit of a side windows. A few more lines going around the car, around the body of the car. Just where I'm painting now, it's still quite damp in there, so I'm going to get that soft edge again. I'm going in with thicker paint on top of a damp surface. Now this blue has dried, so I'm going to get a sharper edge to the detail of those windows. Just continuing on using this smaller detail brush. That's pretty much it on the right hand side. Don't want to put too much detail into that side. Now just above these rooftops, I think I'll get in a bit more of a darker value in there. Not the ideal time to do this. It would have been better if I'd have done this while the background was still quite moist or damp, just to get a bit of a soft edge. So just need to not overdo it. Yeah, it's almost dried up now, that background, so a little bit more difficult to move things around and get a softer edge. Dark shadow over this porch cover. And with these shadows, if I do use neutral tint, I've got to be a bit careful by not making the shadows appear too black. So I need to be adding in a blue or a red just to make it a cool or a warm shadow. Now this is where the fun part comes in, where with this little brush I can just be going around the painting, well this mop brush, and with dry brush strokes just giving the impression of a few marks on the road surface, few tire marks. It's not, if you look at any road surface, very often it's not going to be perfect, so you've got to add in a few lines there to, again, like we did with the background, break up that surface area, add in different textures into it, different marks, different brush marks into it. I need to go in a little bit darker for the doorway and the side of this lifeboat station. So these lines will help with the perspective a bit, just again leading the eye into the distance. Not too many. So I'm giving the impression of the stonework here. Almost dry brush strokes. Maybe just a few lines on this figure to go around the, just to give the impression of an arm there. Make the head a little bit darker. Use my fingertips again to smudge out and make the face a little bit lighter. A painting always needs a few verticals they're quite useful because it's another dimension to a painting, but also they're connecting different elements, different sections of the painting together. So connecting the middle ground with the background, is typically what I'm doing here with these lamp posts and extra lines. I'll do a bit more of that when I get to the final stage with my tube of white paint. Break a few rules with some body paint. I need to add more definition to the big blue door on the lifeboat station. So with a small brush and fairly thick and a darker colour, mainly neutral tint, just go around some of the outside of this doorway and put in a few verticals and horizontals to it. Now, with some yellow paint, I'm going to be, and there's no water now, this is really quite dry yellow paint because the yellow paint had got contaminated with lots of other colours on top. I just had to wash off the top surface to get down to the pure yellow again, but just with a few dabs now, just here and there. A few little things on top of that rooftop, but the main thing I want to use this pure colour for are the grid lines. Now, I could have drawn in those lines beforehand, but I'm just going for it. From the foreground going into the middle ground, and there we are. We're changing the angle. Takes a bit of practice, changing the angle as I move from left to right. So there's an angle to that, and then there's the angle coming down slightly, the angle of the lines going from these sort of lines going from the lifeboat station over to the right. Now they're not continuous lines, so there's a bit of lost and found going on here. Not a continuous line, few gaps in there, just to really, I guess, make it not too perfect, because if this was a busy scene, it would lose paint, it would get weathered over time, particularly on the coast here. So it doesn't need to be too perfect. Lost and found. Now when I've got my small brush, again, this pure white paint right out the tube. I might need to moisten it a little bit if the paint's a bit too thick, but it would have been too fiddly to paint around the posts of the lamp posts and poles going up the road there. So I'm, again, a little rule that some people don't advocate is the use of this body paint here. So just thick paint. Not overdone, and I'm just applying it in those areas where it just needs a little bit of a glint of reflection or a little bit of light. So for example, on the top of the figure, just a little bit, thinking about where the light is coming from, a little bit of light on that side. The lamp posts, again, they're lost and found, not a continuous line. But I think having those verticals, it does transform a scene. In a street scene, landscape, you have trees, you have electricity poles or telephone poles and the like, or fence posts. You got some verticals in there and some horizontals. They definitely, you definitely need that in a painting, just to connect up those different areas. Mustn't get carried away with the the white paint. Just use it in moderation. I use the fingers again for the bit of smudging out on that car windscreen. I put a dab of white paint in there and then just gently smudge it out, and that white doesn't appear so bright, but it gives a bit of a soft edge to it. And that's the painting done. Newquay Harbour. So here is the finished painting. The colours might look a little bit different from the video. I did take this with my the camera on my phone, so the colours tend to be a little bit different from the video camera I'm using for the actual tutorial production. So apologies for that, but the value is the most important thing. So that's the painting, and then we look at the source photograph. A lovely sunny day in Newquay down in Cornwall, and lots of different values, verticals, shapes of shadows, shapes of buildings. Also an exercise, as I've done many times in previous videos, changing. Don't be afraid to change what you see. I didn't follow, for example, I didn't follow exactly these buildings in the background, so they're not an exact copy of the photograph. And all the details over here on the right hand side, I included the figure, missed out some paraphernalia on top of here, all these colourful objects, so missed that out as well. This car in the background, there's too much detail, so don't be afraid to change things, simplify the scene, remove little detailed objects. They won't bring anything to the benefit of the picture, so keep it nice and simple. So back to my finished painting. So I've kept true to the scene as regards the two main buildings here, the Lifeboat Station and the shop. I think these yellow lines helped. Very loosely painted, dry brush strokes. So thinking about the rules of watercolor, I used my fingertips. When I did the sky, I used a big brush, and in a sort of random fashion with the brush strokes going in different directions. Do you see we've got a bit of the impression of some clouds here, some high, like a high cloud level. So that I think worked out quite well. And then the paint straight out the tube, the white, you've got to be a bit careful with not doing it too much, and also if you do this on a regular basis, obviously of course try and keep the white paint as clean as possible, and make sure your brush is really clean before dipping it in the tube. So there we are, a scene from Newquay and the harbour area. By the way, if you like these videos, please support me via my Patreon site. You'll find more details on www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, TimWilmot. Every month or two I set a painting project for my members, and for a small pledge I'll give you a personal critique. Basically that pledge is the cost of a cup of coffee, and this critique going back to you. So you email me your finished painting, and then I give a little video critique back to you afterwards with my own personal impression of the scene, and what you were trying to achieve, and maybe some extra hints and tips for you. So for more details, see that in the description below, or go up to Patreon, my Patreon site, patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. And also don't forget to subscribe to this channel to get automatic notification of new videos, which normally go up every 3 weeks or so. So thanks very much for watching. If you want to see more of my paintings, more information on the workshops, not worktops, I'm not into kitchen worktops yet, workshops, painting workshops and painting holidays, please go to my website, timwilmot.com. So thanks for watching, particularly for those that didn't fast forward through the video. Catch up with you next time. Bye bye.